This offering is a product of what we're calling the Youth Ministry Roundtable, a collaboration between youth ministry professionals or professionals that have youth ministry in their portfolios across the UUA. This includes the Youth and Young Adult Office as well as the UU College of Social Justice. Tonight's presenters include myself. I'm Eric Bliss, the Youth Ministry Specialist for the Pacific Western Region. Lifelong UU, been doing youth work for approximately 20 years. Most recently, before this gig, as a DRE at First Unitarian Society of Denver, also worked for the district as youth chaplain and Quest Camp Director.
My name is Evan Carville-Zemer. I serve in the Central East region as Youth Ministry Program Manager. I come to this work this is my 5th year, but before seminary, before ministry, I taught high school and middle school, and I was a longtime camp counselor. And Hope and Kabir, you can go ahead and introduce yourselves.
My name's Hope Law. I work right now as a baker in Denver. I served on our youth adult committees as a peer chaplain for 2 years with Eric Bliss, and I'm from the Mountain Desert District.
My name's Kabir. I was a youth co-chair of our youth adult committee in the Metro New York District as of last year. I have now graduated and I'm doing my first semester at Rutgers University.
These are the youth ministry competencies that the Youth Roundtable put together, and we are structuring the webinar series this year around these competencies. We hope that these help adults in youth ministry identify growing edges and find resources to help you. And tonight we're focusing on the first competency, able to form healthy relationships and share leadership with youth. Just also for a little 10,000-foot view, these are the UUA Youth Ministry core values created at the 2007 Youth Ministry Summit for our youth ministry. And they're all important aspects where adults have roles, particularly creating healthy and contextually appropriate youth voice and leadership is crucial to have a healthy adult-youth relationship.
My chalice lighting for today was written by Dr. Michelle Reyna, who says, "The best thing you can do to help others take responsibility is to authentically practice the behaviors that you want others to practice."
Thanks, Hope. So let's check in. I know some of you have already typed in the chat box who you are, but we have a few prompts to get you engaged and to learn more about you. Who are you? How many folks are with you? We know some folks are gathering in RE spaces and bringing their advisors together. Where are you, and what are you hoping to learn? Who, how many, where are you, and what are you hoping to learn? And if we don't get to your question with our content, which I assure you is quite comprehensive, we will have time, as Jenica mentioned, for Q&A after our presentation. So youth ministry is religious work, and it's important to emphasize that religious nature. And as such, we ask you to get into a space that calls us to our highest selves. Tonight we'll do a centering prayer, which is a modernized prayer method loosely based on the practice of Lectio Divina. It's a method of silent prayer that prepares us to receive the gift of the divine's presence within us. Centering prayer is grounded in relationship with the connection between all things, God, the great mystery, or whatever you hold to be higher and larger than yourself. It is a practice to nurture and sustain that relationship. You ready? All right, sit in an upright, attentive posture in a way that allows for an erect spine and an open heart. Place your hands comfortably in your lap. When you're ready, breathe deeply. Gently close your eyes and bring to mind a sacred word or image as a symbol of the holy within you. This sacred symbol is often intended to be the same time every time you engage in centering prayer. It helps ground you in the present moment, allowing you to give your undivided, loving, yielded attention to this time and space. To select your symbol, choose a name for the divine or characteristic of the great mystery like love, peace, balance, harmony, laughter. One colleague of mine chose the words guide me. So for the next 30 to 45 seconds, silently with your eyes closed, recall your sacred symbol to begin your prayer. And as you notice your thoughts, gently return to that sacred word. Do this whenever you notice your thoughts creeping in. All right, I invite you back to this space in this moment. For those of you watching the recording, since you lead such a busy life, I hope that extra time was well used and grounded you in this space. And in the chat box, feel free to share your word or symbol. So I want to share with you a vision for adults working with youth, and I want to start with a what not to story. Growing up Unitarian Universalist, YRU was a critical part of my life. I remember many evenings spent in church, lock-ins, and other events. So it was very formative. And yet, when I look back and I think about the adults who were engaged, there was a lot of mouth breathing going on. And what I mean by that is kind of sitting idly by and just letting things happen as they will. We youth got away with a lot. And at the same time, when I bridged, we left without any kind of real sense of UU identity. And it's only by accident that we ended up coming back, or I ended up coming back to this faith at all. No faith formation really occurred as a result. Next slide. So when you are working with youth, it's important to have certain characteristics. And one of those that we would hold up as being authentic. And to define that, we talk about authenticity as being real with the youth without oversharing, without trying to be hip. Youth crave authentic relationships with adults. When I think back to my high school teaching days, like Evan, I taught high school for about a decade. And when students would return or come back to visit my classroom, they talk about how in that class they felt treated like human beings, not like inferior individuals. Youth are human beings too. You can help model what authenticity looks like in these settings without sharing war stories, what you did back then, back in the day, while also being open and honest about who you are and what your values are. It's a certain kind of vulnerability without leaning on the youth. I refer to this as a quote from Reverend Mike Moran, also from Denver. When working with youth ministry, it's not about you. Next slide, please. Second important attribute to hold up is being present. And I don't know how many of y'all have read the book Youth Ministry 3.0 by Mark Ostreicher. It's an easy read. It's a short read. And it's got one kind of big idea. And that idea is that it's important to be present for today's youth. The reason the book is called Youth Ministry 3.0 is in the previous iteration of Successful Youth Ministry 2.0, there was this emphasis on programs and events. And if we just threw great programs and had these great events, youth would turn out. And what we found is that's not true. And so there's this shift now to Youth Ministry 3.0, as Mark Ostreicher calls it, which he refers to as contextualization. And what Mark means by that is being present in a way where adults are approachable, where adults are affable, engaged, excited, and also agile and flexible with the program, such that events that are happening in the youth's lives in today's world are highlighted rather than a structured and rigid curricular approach. So questions to think about when you're trying to be present, when you're trying to contextualize, is what issues are facing the youth today? What issues are facing the youth in your group? Are you delving into those issues sensitively without creating drama and codependency? That can be a tough tightrope to walk, but walk it we must. Next slide, please. So I want to start this next important attribute with another story, unfortunately a negative example of kind of the worst worship ever. And this summer I visited with a camp in the Pacific Western region. It was a tremendous time, and yet at this camp of 100 campers plus, maybe 15 of the entire community, 15 individuals went to evening worship, which were run exclusively by 2 youth. There was no adult mentoring or coaching. And during the worship, they would pose these kind of open-ended, large existential questions to the group. And then there would be this really awkward silence. And so after a couple of those worships, I approached the youth and said, I'd like to give you some feedback about your worship format, recommending that instead of posing these questions to the group of 15, to pose questions and have them talk in small groups, 2s and 3s, to process those broad questions that were being tossed out. They were receptive, and worship dramatically improved the rest of the week. And so what I'm highlighting there is this idea of mentoring and coaching, partnering with the youth to make sure that the ministry is executed at its best, and checking in with them, providing constructive feedback, monitoring and reflecting. This is important too when the adults are engaged in these activities, that you're modeling the activities that you want your youth to engage in. Next one, please. So spirituality is key. I gave a webinar last December interviewing congregations from around the country and identifying attributes that made their youth groups strong. And there were 9 terrific attributes, like being incorporated into the life of the congregation, engaging in social justice. But all of the congregations I interviewed, from Anchorage to Brooklyn, none of them engaged in regular spiritual practice with their youth when they met, which broke my heart, because spiritual practice and engaging in religious work is our unique offering. They can get the social piece, they can get the social justice piece outside of church, the spiritual piece, the milestones, the rituals. This is the place where they can get them, and we're providing them with tools to deal with the rigors of a complex life. How do you celebrate when your heart is filled with so much joy? How do you express remorse when you need to ask for forgiveness? How do you deal with the loss of a loved one? And then finally, and this is the piece that I want to emphasize, being a returning you, is spiritual practice gives us a sense of home. And so by cultivating practice with the youth and creating these opportunities, you're giving youth a sense of a call back to Unitarian Universalism, back to your congregation. And in talking about boundaries in the adult's role, it's very important and key to mention that adults must get their own emotional, physical, and spiritual needs met outside the group. Youth ministry is not the place for it. So to review, our vision of adult roles and working with and partnering with youth, being authentic, being present, contextualizing, modeling the behaviors you want to see, the outcomes you want to see, mentoring and coaching, incorporating spirituality and making sure that those spiritual needs of your adults are being met outside the group, that youth ministry is not a crutch for them.
So crucial to healthy youth-adult interactions and relationships and shared leadership is an adult understanding of where the boundaries are. And I want to say a couple of things first off about boundaries. Some boundaries feel like and really are rigid rules. I hope everyone in this call is clear that it is never appropriate for adults in youth ministry or adults at all to engage in sexual behavior with youth. Other boundaries can feel less clear, and they vary by moment, by youth, by context. And if we're actually present and engaged with youth in the context we're in and trying to meet their needs, we will encounter situations that we need to discern what appropriate, healthy boundaries look like in this moment. So rather than sort of a set of rules about boundaries, this discussion is going to be some examples, stories, and some guiding questions. Because if you're present and you care, you'll be wrestling with some of these. So the first one is hugging and touch. Many youth need and want adult affection and care. Many youth want to be able to hug adults. Two guiding principles here are having the youth initiate and creating a culture of affirmative consent, that is asking. So in the Central East youth ministry communities, we are working to develop a culture where we all ask everybody before hugging or touching or anything. So people are getting choices about their bodies. That we're creating a space where each of us is getting to listen to that still small voice say yes and no. That if we're not free to say no, we're not really free to say yes. So in that context, I'm really clear with youth, as clear as I can be, that I'm open to hugs. I care about them. I want to express that, but I'm going to let them initiate so that they don't feel pressure. And when they initiate, I do stop and make them ask. And there are times when really the best answer for me is no, and I model that as well. The story here of this gone wrong, really, had a adult engaged in youth ministry early in my time as staff, and another adult came to me to say, I saw something happening I'm concerned about. This man is tall, broad-chested, deep voice, and he was hugging enthusiastically youth at the start of a program, greeting youth he loved. He loves the youth and is trying to express that. What this other adult noticed is that some of those youth were just imperceptibly pulling back slightly. This is an adult who knows that he's tall and knows that he's a deep voice and just was missing that one moment of letting the youth initiate to be able to make a choice because he was just trying to express affection. Non-sexual, of course, is important, and important that it appear non-sexual as well as being non-sexual. As human beings, there's a lot of things that can be sexual or erotic or appear sexual or erotic, whether we intend them to or not. An example of this could be, I had some adults who couldn't really understand, and we had to have a conversation about this, that adults shouldn't be sharing bedding at our youth overnights. It doesn't matter that nothing's happening. It should not ever look to the youth like the adults are engaged in any kind of sexual activity, whether between adults or with youth. So even if there's a kind of touch that feels okay to a youth, if it can be perceived as sexual by another person there, it's going to make the space not as safe. And public. It's important that our touch be in public, that we create a culture where we are in public with youth. We aren't engaged in any kind of activities privately, really ever. This creates a kind of transparency in our settings that make it harder for adults to cross lines inadvertently and ultimately keeps our youth safe. Just summarize here, youth initiate, creating a culture of affirmative consent, not sexual, erotic, and public. And a guiding question also can be, are you primarily giving or primarily getting your need met? If it's about you needing hugs, then maybe it's not the space to be in at that point in time. Youth are really, really, many of them sensitive and compassionate, and they want to help take care of us. And it's just not what their role is in this space.
Evan, did you want to preface this slide before I dove in?
No, go ahead. You dive in.
Okay. So we're talking about boundaries and minding healthy ones between adults and youth. And as you can see on the slide, the title is Take Space, Make Space. And many of you may have previously heard of this as step up, step back. That's a common norm that you find on youth and other covenants and youth circles. And we've shifted the language a bit to be less ableist. Take space if the opportunity presents itself for you to share your ideas. Please do. Make space, ensure that you're not occupying that space too largely, especially our adults. One of the things that I try and keep in mind when I'm in any sort of group conversation, being a white heterosexual male, is to never get the first word and never get the last word. So questions to ask about this in terms of how you're participating is, are you present? You know, I mentioned that mouth breathing earlier on with my advisors when I was a young one. So you can't mouth breathe your way through youth ministry. Are you present? Are you engaged? Are you participating? Is it equal? Is it obtrusive? Self-awareness is key here. Other questions to ask: should I be here? How should I show up when I am here? I peeked in on this conversation. Is the youth's body language welcoming me? Why or why not? It could be that the adult's presence is making the conversation awkward or stilted. It could also be that inappropriate behavior is occurring. So being tuned in is key. So times to make space during games is it appropriate for you to be in a touching game with youth? Most often the answer to that is going to be no. There's going to be some rituals that you see in youth worship that may be best between adult and youth, although if it isn't inappropriate, encouraging that partnership, encouraging youth adult, that multi-generational interchange can be very lively. And then as we mentioned, some conversation. Should I be here?
So another area of this kind of conversational boundary is when youth ask us questions, or when we're tempted to share more about our lives than may be appropriate. General guideline of not sharing personal sexual drug experience is a really good hard line to keep, and rarely sharing intimate or deep details. And yet there are parts of our lives that are really helpful for the youth to know about, and they want to know us, and they're looking to their future and trying to just get a sense of what possibilities are. So here's some questions that can help. Asking, what is the youth really asking for? The question is not always the question. In fact, it often isn't the question. So a youth might ask, how do lesbians have sex? Might be the question they want to ask, but instead they ask, well, how do you have sex? Well, how I have sex is not the question I'm going to answer, but I can say I'm not comfortable answering that. But if you're wondering about kinds of queer sex, I can certainly talk about ways in which people engage in sex that's not heterosexual or heteronormative. There are parts of our lives that are helpful for a youth to know, or that they may really need. And so asking, what is the youth needing here? And sometimes disclosure of things is really helpful. For instance, I'm a former foster parent, and I have a fair amount of familiarity with the effects of child abuse and the whole legal system. And it's helpful for the youth to know that sometimes. I'm an incest and child abuse survivor. I'm public about that, so that the youth who have experienced similar things know they're not alone in their community. And the third guiding question here is, am I ready to share this? There's certainly parts of our lives that we're still processing, that we're still needy about, that it's not the right time to share it with youth. And so, keep it in the therapy session or with our partners or our friends and process it there. And then later it might be something that's appropriate to share. One thing just to remember is that hearing one person's story always evokes ours. It's how our brains are wired. It can give us information like, okay, your story is bringing up this story, so I might know a little bit more about how you're feeling. But it also can be a challenge to then sort of sit on our story so we can be with the youth and say, if appropriate, so I just want you to know that I share a not dissimilar experience, and then go back to their story. It also can be appropriate to redirect the question, and maybe they're really asking, like, how do I make good decisions now as a teenager? Well, okay, let's actually focus on you making decisions. You don't really need to know the mistakes I made as a teenager to make decisions for you, and I can have that conversation with you. Also, we may be skirting the edges of conversations that need redirection to become healthy. And it is sometimes our role to hold the comfort of all youth rather than the ones who may be being more provocative, as youth are prone to boundary pushing as part of their developmental stage.
Indeed. Youth push boundaries. This is where youth are at. I remember being a 15-year-old young man and not having my license, stealing my parents' car, and leaving poetry on a crush's doorstep. Not a good decision. Not a good choice. But this is how youth are wired. They underestimate emotional risk and often don't have the kind of prefrontal capacity to see long-term consequence. But there's a lot of positive here. Dan Siegel in his book Brainstorm talks about how youth are the most creative humans because of that willingness to take risks. We want them to take those risks, to leave home and to become their own individuals. And at the same time, acknowledging the space where youth are at is really important. It's why we can't, as adults, allow completely youth-led community. It is a partnership, and the adults, as mentioned before, must be engaged, must be tuned in, and willing to empower or disempower if the train begins to derail. It is essentially the adult's job to hold those appropriate boundaries and yet also understand why the pushback may be happening.
Just to repeat something Eric mentioned earlier about meeting adult needs. There are adults who cross lines with youth because they don't read social cues and they don't notice they're crossing those lines. There are adults who cross lines because they're predatory and enjoy crossing lines. And the rest of us can cross lines too. And we usually do that when our needs aren't being met. When we're too tired, we snap, we're too hungry, or lonely, and we need a space to be. And we need to model getting our needs met, model leadership that involves self-care. Our youth leaders need self-care too. Our youth leaders can push themselves too hard, not take care of themselves, and that's when they tend to damage community, and we need to model meeting our own needs. And I want to add with the spiritual here, there's a real deep damage done to all of Unitarian Universalism when we have adults engaged in youth communities who say, this is my spiritual place. Sunday morning doesn't work for me. This is the only kind of worship that works for me. Our adults are also saying to our youth, there's not going to be anywhere for you either when you're an adult. There's not a place for you. I would much rather have adults say, yeah, sermon sandwich isn't for me either. That's why I'm part of small group ministry, or that's why I helped start the Zen group. Modeling that we can get needs met, spiritual needs met in a diverse number of ways in our UU community, and that it's the youth worship and the youth space is not the only place for particular kinds of spiritual needs to be met.
We adults have yammered on long enough. It's time to hear from our youth voices. Speaking of voice, so Hope, will you share a little bit about adult roles and partnership?
Yeah, I would love to. One of the most like influential experiences I've had working with adults on a team was I served as the youth peer chaplain alongside Colleen, who was from the Pacific Northwest. And part of our role there at General Assembly was to work on the right relations team. If you're not familiar with that or GA, we work as sort of the in-between of any issues that might have come up at the conference. So if someone is having an emotional problem and they need to be connected with a chaplain, or they're having a problem with the way the space is set up and they need to talk to the leaders of the conference, we worked as the mediators to get them in contact with people. But one of the coolest parts about being on this team was that Colleen and I served just as equally as any of the adults on the team. And that was really important because, like it's been mentioned, youth really crave having like a genuine and kind of deep leadership role, but sometimes that can be hard to find a space for us. So sort of treating us as equals in that sense that our opinions were just as important, that we we would commit and we would be to every meeting that was asked, and we would work 2 or 3 shifts throughout the conference. And it was important that they heard back what we had to say just as much as we were hearing what they had to say. So the boundaries of the conference or of our group were really set in the youth adult setting by just holding us accountable for our responsibilities at the conference, and really just meeting us where we needed to be, and also like knowing that we would meet them where they needed to be. So that was really, really cool as a youth, because it was very empowering to work with adults on a team where you felt equally respected and important in that.
Thank you, Hope. And I think that shows us kind of how important it can be to present opportunities for youth voice, how empowering that can feel, and show us that there are youth who have who like Hope and Kabir and Colleen Lee from the Mid-America region, who on the spectrum of leadership are up there and can operate almost autonomously and get work done and accomplish what any adult could. That said, our youth are on a spectrum of leadership, and not all are at the same end of that spectrum as Kabir and Hope and Colleen are. And so this graph kind of shows you how, again, not to sit idly by, but depending on the level or amount of leadership there on the y-axis, depends on the growth, maturity, development, and leadership capacity of the youth. And depending on that leadership capacity, that will either reduce or increase the adult's involvement. As you notice, looking closely at this, though, it's never completely gone. And this is why it's so tough. This is why youth ministry can be such a challenge, because it's constantly changing in the circumstance and different for each youth you work with.
Youth empowerment in this kind of way, this kind of shared leadership, is really an ideal, and is very difficult to have feel perfect all the time. Usually, like any balancing act, where slightly one way or the other off where would feel great. I think there are 2 important UU principles that lead into why this is such an important part of our youth ministry. One is our first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of every person, and that of course includes youth. And the other one, stated in the RE language, that every person should have a voice in matters that affect them. And so youth ministry definitely affects youth, and they should have a key voice in that. There's some real challenges to this kind of way of working between youth and adults. The youth don't have experience doing this usually anywhere else. They've been socialized under adult thumbs, and they're used to that. And adults have been socialized to be the ones in charge to fix things, and we don't have a lot of experience doing this. This also varies by context as well as the leadership development of the particular youth. So the coming of age service versus the senior high service, the overnight at the church versus the service trip to New Orleans is going to require different levels of adult involvement because of the different experiences the youth have in those different contexts. One thing to really keep in mind here is that this is a way of working together that centers youth needs and leadership, that we're here for today's youth. We're not even here for youth from yesterday. Youth empowerment and youth voice actually now means that Kabir and Hope have a role in helping today's youth have a voice. And that we may have opinions, we'll talk a little bit more about that, but the youth needs and leadership are at the center. And Kabir has a story about this sharing leadership spectrum.
Yeah, so I have an example of an advisor perfectly acting on that graph. We were in a planning meeting of sorts, and the youth leaders who were elected were new at it. They were not totally comfortable, and so they needed some help. So we all got in the room, and it was a little disorganized and messy at first, and not much was getting done. And the advisor very carefully, he waited, he sat there for a few minutes, let them have a chance to try and take charge. But when that wasn't happening, he slowly just started asking some gentle pointing questions, like, what are we doing here? And then that got answered, and then he slowly started asking, so how do we go about doing that? And so he very carefully monitored the situation and saw a way to help encourage and push those youth to get to what they needed to be able to get done.
Thanks, Kabir. That delicate balance in the moment of how much is my voice needed here. This model of shared leadership includes adult needs like sleep, respect, food, a break. This is not a model of because you signed up for youth ministry, you never get any sleep. There are ways, though, to put our needs on the table that work and ways that tend to erode relationship. I have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old, and I do not get a lot of sleep. When I come to youth events, I say clearly to the youth, I can't be the adult who stays up all night and goes home sleep deprived because my spouse at home is getting sleep deprived, and I need to go home and help her catch up on sleep. They understand, they're gracious, they're empathetic, they make space for that need. If I came in and said, I'm sorry, bedtime is 11:30 because that's the bedtime I want, it wouldn't go the same way. So modeling that I statement and then expressing the need in a very human way rather than I'm in charge way creates an entirely different relationship. As we've said, this is a form of shared leadership that involves adult presence and participation. This is a leadership con in the Central East region, and we're all getting to know each other, adults and youth. We're part of what's going on, even if we aren't in charge at the moment. And actually, that's a way of holding up youth leadership, is to follow youth when they're the ones leading and they've got it under control. All right, Kabir, ready for your second story?
All right, so this is a situation where we had an advisor who was using his power more than what would have been the ideal. So he had a tendency to talk slowly, and it was hard to cut him off. It was hard to do anything other than listen to him. So we would have to listen to him. And oftentimes the stuff he was saying was 5 steps behind where we were in the discussion. So we had already moved on from this point, but he kept trying to take the conversation back to a place because he disagreed with what we were discussing and where we were going with the conversation. So that was rather disempowering to have to deal with this advisor who kept just taking away from our general ability to have a discussion.
So we need to be careful. We need to remember that youth are used to be under adult thumbs, may not even be trying to take over. We're socialized to fix, to have the answer, and we just have to be careful about how we're using our authority and how we're acting when we're not exercising authority. I'll talk a little bit about just how to discern when it's an authority situation, when it's not. That's where we're headed next.
So speaking of authority, we UUs have a complicated relationship with authority. We swim against the stream. And out west, particularly, we have conversations about authority. The minister is doing this and making all the calls, and the board, da 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 da. I hear it in a lot of the work that I do, and this can create some interesting dynamics between adults and youth as well, right? Because the adults are typically in that role of authority. So, next slide. Authority is responsibility plus accountability, and I love how in Hope's tale she talked about that accountability piece, and it's I would further highlight Hope's kind of dedication to accountability, because she wasn't able to join us for yesterday's webinar, but instead recorded videos for us, which she detailed as being kind of a long and onerous process, but she kept her promise and was able to participate even though she wasn't on site. And so it's important to kind of emphasize that in our work with youth, that we can share power, but that means responsibility, and which includes follow through and being accountable for your actions. In the West, that power dynamic piece is mentioned regularly. Adults have the power, youth don't, and therefore we should empower the youth. And I agree with that to a point. Where that point breaks down is liability. And that's our next section that Evan will get into. But this is why it's important that youth know that the power that they receive, A, they are accountable for, and B, they get from those that are truly accountable, the adults. Adults can be fired, they can go to jail, they can be sued. The youth, not so much. That said, it's very, very important to own your appropriate power with compassion and recognize that you're still in relationship even when you're not directly setting limits. You're at the table, contributing, listening, supporting, mentoring, and providing feedback in real time. No mouth-breathing youth ministry.
I think Eric's really hit the important parts of liability. I want to note that next month's topic is safety, and Kim Sweeney and I will be doing quite a bit more with this. I believe it's empowering for youth to understand liability and the sources of adult anxiety that go with that, so that they can be creative problem solvers with us within the constraints of the systems that we're in, instead of just angry that adults are being bossy and not understanding why. It also eliminates the adult ability just to hide behind liability as an excuse. If they understand it, we really have to explain why we're making the decisions we make, and I think that's good. It's also important for youth turning 18 to understand that they can now be held legally liable if they are with a group of youth and not making responsible decisions. So one of the concepts that I've taken from my outdoor education experience is the concept of acceptable failure, which reminds me to be clear about what my goal is versus what the youth goal is. And when is it okay when they don't reach their goals? In the world of helicopter parenting, lots of youth haven't had the experience of failing. They have their parents stepping in and saving them from failure. And we have lots of good research at this point of the mental health consequences for those youth as young adults of this kind of parenting. For some of our youth, just some of the opposite experience, for some of our youth, having the experiences of failure and learning from failure and learning how to rebound from failure is a life lesson they're getting in our youth ministry. I believe that's an important really important part. And the other place that comes up for me is that when I lead workshops covenanting between youth and adults, almost always the group of youth will come back and say, we need to learn from our own experience. We need you to give us a chance to try our idea out, even if you think it won't work. And we need a chance to learn this way. They basically say, back off, even if you try to give us a shot. And I think it's really important for us to let them do that. And that there are levels of unacceptable failure. Safety is one of those. I don't think it's an acceptable failure to just let the coming of age service flop in front of the congregation. Now, a senior high service, they want to experiment with something, and I don't think it's going to go so well. Maybe I'll let them do that. When do I step in? Where do I not step in? Is this something that we could just Okay, we don't get to go on this paintball trip. Okay, let's talk about what went wrong in the planning so we can do a better job next time. When I can be clear as an adult where that acceptable failure line is, I can act much more clearly in a role. Another concept we've developed here in Central East, we're calling the decision donut. I didn't name it, but I'm loving the image. The outer ring is the safe container that we hold, the absolute line. You may not run out and dance in the lightning storm in the rain. No. We are not jumping off the church roof. No. The donut-y part of this is where we as an adults have a role. We have requirements that the decision must reach. We can go on that rock climbing to the rock climbing gym, but we need to plan it in a way that we've fulfilled the safety policy of the church and we get our permission form signed and we've included everybody in the decision, all those pieces. And the middle part is when we're just part of the group in a way. So we're ordering pizza, what kind of toppings, how many slices do people want? Maybe we're deciding between playing games or dancing to loud music. And I can say I prefer the games, but I get your plugs if you go with the loud music. So when we as adults can be clear on what's the acceptable failure or not acceptable failure and where are we in this decision donut, we can be clear with the youth what's going on and transparent. I try to be transparent. I try to say, I don't have any special role here, but this is my opinion if you care. Maybe not. Or I'll say, this is a place where I need to be clear that the outcomes meet certain requirements. Here are the requirements. Here's why. And occasionally it's a take charge and do it. I was just at an event recently where 911 had to be called. I didn't share youth leadership. I just called 911 and managed the scene for a while. And that's our role as adults.
So some skills that we'd like to highlight in this webinar are fourfold: pastoral, safety, communication, and coaching. And we're going to be able to hear from Hope a little bit later with the story about coaching. But I want to start with the pastoral piece. So when we talk about pastoral presence, we're talking about understanding what's going on for the youth. A quick story, we had an incident of racial injustice in one of our districts in PWR and asked all our youth and adults to participate in intercultural competency training to ensure that this type of incident wouldn't happen again, or at least we'd taken some steps to prevent it. After receiving the training, I got a flood of feedback from the youth talking about, oh, we already know all this and we know exactly what we're doing. We just want to go act on behalf of justice. And what I was really seeing through the entire process, including the incident itself, was a confusion of intent and impact. And that's often where we go wrong in terms of our marginalized folks. We have a certain intent, but our impact doesn't match that intent. And so I did a follow-up training with many of the folks who are participating in this culture shift. And you could see the light bulb go off. Okay, wait a second. We're bulls in a china shop. Our intent isn't matching our impact, and it's really important that we do that. And so it's important when we are being pastoral that we're listening to the youth frustration and let that be okay, even sympathize, even if the situation is unavoidable. In this case, we were able to avoid it. Understanding youth are often intimidated by adults and need experiences with youth voice to learn to hold their own with adults. That's being pastoral. Coming back to that presence piece, knowing that you're there, that you have their back, even if they fall short, right? We're a covenantal faith. We're never going to always live up to that covenant. And so knowing that we have their back and support them even through failure, as Evan highlighted, is key. And then finally, how to hear that a youth feels stepped on and know that it may be partly our fault as adults and partly the result of their own accumulated experiences. So we can expect some degree of drama, learn from it, and remember that the youth and the adults are learning life lessons.
So more skills are being able to say no if you feel comfortable. Sometimes we want the youth to like us and be friends with them, and we're not friends, and sometimes they're not going to like us. And we need to be able to say no and be in a relationship. Part of that's the empathy thing. Part of it is how we say no. Sometimes it's better to ask questions. So, okay, you want to go do this thing. What are the steps we'll need to do to get there? Instead of just leaping in and telling them that. They can figure that out through the questions. And we can affirm the passion and enthusiasm, even as we say, this is no way we can get that to work out. Second safety skill is, as I was discussing with the acceptable failure and decision donut, we need to be confident where the safe container is. We can be more transparent. We're more reliable. The youth trust us more. They'll pick up on the lack of confidence, and they will both push boundaries harder, and they will feel less safe. They need to know that we know what safety looks like, and that is a non-negotiable for us.
Communication is a key skill, critically, because it's easy in working with many different stakeholders in youth ministry, the youth, families, religious educators, and others, to get triangulated between adults and the youth, between youth and youth, or between parents, church staff, or lay leaders. So first of all, coach and mentor both the adults you work with and the youth that it's about transparency. It's about communicating directly with individuals that you have concerns with or comments. There's a training that some of us UUA staff have gotten called Passing the Blue Dot, which means if you're stuck in the middle of a conversation, the best thing you can do is get out of the middle and bring those entities together. And this training was originally designed for middle management and corporations, but youth ministry is middle management. You are often working between youth and between adults, higher ups, ministers, and so on, board presidents. And so it's key to bring those voices together and have them communicate directly with one another. Involve the DRE and minister from the get-go, and work with the youth, encouraging them to try new things in leadership without handing them too much. Partner with them through this process, staying supportive, and helping to connect and make those meetings happen. Hope.
So a story that I have about being in good relation with an adult actually relates to Eric and I. We worked together pretty closely throughout my YRU involvement. I was our youth adult committees for our district, our peer chaplain for 2 years. And part of that role is going out and actually leading a chaplain training, a weekend-long chaplain training for youth in different districts. So one of the trainings we taught was in Seattle. And it was really scary to me. I was like 16, and I think it was even like my first time flying alone. And now I was like expected to lead a training with Eric. But one of the most important parts was that throughout the training, Eric and I, when we would meet up, he'd say, "You're doing great, but involve yourself more. I want to hear more from you. I want you to be more present in this." And so just really like a gentle sort of nudging into my own leadership, while sort of like encouraging and letting me know that I was doing okay, and that, you know, it was okay to acceptable failure. It was okay to put myself out there, and maybe I say something and it's not quite right, or I don't feel comfortable. That's okay. But just knowing that he had my back and that I had his support throughout the training really helped foster a healthy relationship and strong youth leadership for me.
So some ways to coach: ask questions instead of telling how. coaching the leaders on the side, you hear really clearly in Hope's story. I think that's such an important skill. We can be pointing out ways that group dynamics, we can be helping you think through how to deal with those, and it impacts all the youth more strongly when a youth leader is able to deal with them. And yet we have an important role in helping be sure that our youth leaders are ready and able to do that. Sometimes deciding when to pick up the pieces or when to pick up the pieces and put them on the table. Sometimes I feel like my job is to say, hey, y'all, we forgot this, and put it back on the table, even multiple times for the same thing. So it's everybody's to deal with. And then just being able to name concerns instead of solving them. I think as adults, I really think we're trained to solve and fix. And even saying, so my adult anxiety here is that we're moving pretty slowly through this agenda and we only have this much time left and I'm worried we're not going to get to this important thing. Put it on the table and then everyone else can solve it instead of me trying to take over the meeting from my anxiety or push things harder or faster. Coaching also is about sharing information. We as adults sometimes have a lot of information that you may not have. Everything from how to get something in the church newsletter to the particular tact that might work better in a conversation with adults. We can share that information with youth so that they have it too. And we're going to move to Q&A here in a minute, but we wanted to give both Hope and Kabir a chance to chime in and add things, add their thoughts here before doing that.
I have, just jumping off what you were saying, Evan, about some of the putting the stuff on the table thing. I've seen it work incredibly well when all the different points, all the different issues, if someone's concerned about this, someone else is concerned about that. I think the best solutions are when the adults or whoever's in charge just says, look, here are the problems. What do you want to do about them? And we've seen it with many situations, and then that has been, it's always led to a good outcome. Hope?
Something that I have to add, and I've actually talked with adults about this before, is that because it is such in everyday life, it is normally so adult dominated, the relationship. Something that I've talked about with adults is embracing sort of the uncomfortableness of those relationships that form in youth adult contact. That doesn't mean, crossing boundaries that shouldn't be crossed, but that means just try to meet me where I'm at, even though maybe that was 20, 30, 40 years ago for you. Walk a day in my shoes, or be silly with me, or just try to embrace what's uncomfortable, because the relationship that can form after that is so much healthier and so much closer.
Thank you both. Those of you listening to the recording or on now, it's really special for us to have Kabir and Hope joining us. Hope's worked extensively with Eric, and I've worked extensively with Kabir. So it's wonderful for us to get you to be able to hear these great young people and their perspectives. And we're going to jump into Q&A. Jenica is available to help bring those questions, read the questions, since you can't read your questions out loud. And all four of us are here to answer questions.
And we've got our first question already. This one is from Jennifer, who wonders, one of the issues that we're dealing with in our group is that we have a small number of teens in YRUU. It can make it challenging to remain teen-centered. No real question, just happy to hear other thoughts on this. We have 8 who are registered, but week to week, 2 to 4 people show up.
I'll just throw my thoughts out there quickly. Any group of youth can be a powerful experience, but what it looks like in different size groups is very different. So having a clear understanding of the purpose of this group, I think, is really important. What is this small group of youth getting when they get together? And how is it meeting a need that's not being met somewhere else? With the purpose more clear, it may be easier to keep it youth centric. But I understand there's a challenge there with the number of people in the room. And it might also be that having some purposeful youth and adult covenanting would help. Really, in my workshops, I split youth and adults up and have both groups talk about their anxieties and come back together, share some about that, and then split back up and do some purposeful generational covenanting. Other folks' thoughts?
Something that we did in my congregation when we had smaller
So when Hope unfreezes, we'll let her share.
Sorry about the technical glitch. I'll sound off just briefly. Two things, just kind of highlighting other content, previous content, is that spiritual piece. I've found that youth groups that do embrace religious practice get more interest and more enthusiasm because the youth are hungry for it, and they turn up because those needs are being met, sometimes that they don't even know they have. The other piece is that topical, flexible piece. And so off the missional work that Evan recommended, I'm recommending some visional work with the youth to determine, what is it that you want to investigate this year? What is it you want to delve into? When I was DRE at First Unitarian Denver, we would often have a kickoff retreat at the beginning of the year to build enthusiasm and then get input from the youth so that we were being topical, flexible, and bringing in the youth's ideas into the program. Hope, are you back with us?
No. Do we have other questions?
Kabir, did you have insight you wanted to add?
Not really.
All good.
Another question earlier in the chat was looking for good ideas for youth advisor relationships in large group dynamics, and that's one you can speak to, Kabir, I would think. What should large youth groups be looking for good youth adult relationships?
Well, I would say that in large group settings, if you as the advisor feel that you need to give feedback, I've had advisors do it when we're in the middle of a circle and talking to the group, and sometimes it's needed if it's like, oh, we're going to have a fire drill this time and we get the time wrong or we get the location where we have to go wrong, then it's needed. But most of the time I would say if that feedback's needed, wait until after the circle is over to give that feedback, because it can greatly diminish the power of whoever's trying to speak and instruct the large group.
Your congregation also, if I'm understanding correctly, has some regularly scheduled meetings between whichever youth are taking leadership and your staff member responsible for the program?
Yes. Yeah, we have planning meetings once a week during the week with the elected leaders of the group. And so that in itself is forced youth-adult relationship.
And we have another question from Leah, who asks, can you talk a bit about parent support / involvement? Our culture has been for the parents to be very hands-off.
Before we get to that, though, it looks like Hope is back. Can Hope share her response to that initial question while we're thinking about that one? I know, Leah. Lee, you don't mind waiting just a minute, do you?
Where did you catch me? I don't know when I cut off.
Right at the beginning.
Right at the beginning?
Yeah.
Well, something that we did in my congregation was having youth to try to direct the purpose of our meetings. So it wasn't just silence or awkward or let's play games or watch a movie every time. Is we would write down things that we wanted to learn about as youth. So maybe that was sex ed in different forms, or healthy relationships, or how to communicate non-verbally, or what does the Islam religion look like? I don't really know a lot about that. So it could be really anything. And then we could decide the week of if, we didn't know what we were talking about, or sometimes we would plan out our months. Like, okay, well, this week we're going to learn about this, and maybe you can research it a little bit and come back. So that was really cool that it was kind of our self-guided curriculum, but we also had the adults there to share their wisdom with us.
So Leah's question on parent involvement. Kabir or Hope, do you want to go first on that? Or not?
I think that's kind of a difficult bridge to gap, because for me, like, coming to YRUU was like a place where I could be my own person, and I didn't really want my parents to be there. So as a parent, maybe that looks like accepting that you need to give some space, and that this is just your youth doing their own thing, and they're in a safe space, and they're learning about themselves, and that looks different from how they learn about themselves when they're with you. So I cut off the first part of the question, but I would say if it is uncomfortable for you, maybe talk to your youth about it, but for the most part, let them be separate.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's a very kid by kid basis, so you should know your kid, and I think most kids don't want their parents around, but there are some kids who do need and want their parent support there. So it's just based off what the kid wants.
I want to make a distinction between where we create age-appropriate space for youth to be together and where our youth ministry is multi-generational or larger. So I see a really ton of great relationships between parents and youth at our youth conferences. They aren't in the same touch group. They get to negotiate boundaries about how close and how far they are, and the parents are learning how to be better parents because they're getting coached in the same, the same dance we're talking about is about letting your youth grow up. And so the parents are able to learn more and do more together, and like together as parents talk about that. In a space of 60, 80 youth, that gives their youth chances that like they're not right with each other. In fact, they might not talk all weekend. I have some youth adult pairs that have a ritual that they go through between home when they're parents and youth and when they're at the event. So there's this moment actually where both of them start swearing is this particular ritual I'm thinking about. And then the way home, they change back. And then, so there's no talking about homework. There's no all that parent stuff at the youth event. So there's a difference there between the youth group and the going to this youth event together. There's also, I think, a difference between youth group and how are youth involved in the ministry of the congregation. That could be multi-generational breakfast. That could be working on social justice together. Lots of other places that parents can be a really helpful and important part of having youth be part of the whole congregation, and really often can be a very effective advocate for that because they know the capacity and talents of their youth and their youth friends.
Awesome. We've got a number of other questions. Jeff asks, I would like to tell youth the guidelines for hugging so they understand why I don't initiate. I worry about the shy kid who needs a hug and thinks I don't care. Appropriate to explain up front?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've been at things where I've seen Evan explain just all those guidelines she went over, and everyone understands and is all right with it.
All right, and Sally asks, does anyone create youth adult covenants that name the best ways that youth and adults can be in relationship, thinking similar to a staff covenant separate from covenant of the youth group covenant?
I'm advocating for that. I'm not sure I can give you an example of anyone that I have managed to get to do it. I do it at my trainings, and I think it's really effective.
I think you can covenant in any group that you're in. Just being intentional with that and making space to do that. So I think that any form of group, however that looks, if it's at a multi-gen conference or if it's in your youth group or if it's in a smaller group in your church, opening up the idea and just creating space for it and directing it.
The best covenants I've seen created, our good friend and current tech guru, Jenica Davis Hockett, has led with some terrific guiding questions. Jenica, do you have those accessible that you could throw in the chat box? They're terrific for creating a covenant.
I don't have them accessible off the top of my head, but I can find the video that I generated them from, and they're actually in the new Bringing the Web to Life curriculum, and I'll put a link in the chat box to that as well. And we have one final question from Diane, who says, our youth group now has a curriculum decided on by adults, whereas in the past we had a retreat in the fall and the youth generated what they wanted to do for the year. I wondered what most youth groups do in this regard. How has the philosophy of youth leadership changed since I took training 10 to 12 years ago?
I'm seeing a shift, and the shift that I'm seeing is from, I'm curious if what Kabir and Hope think about this, shift from just putting it all in the youth lap, which is what I saw happening 10 to 12 years ago, to supporting the youth in creating things that work for them. Some congregations are say building that on the 6 pillars of youth ministry, and even having different youth responsible for thinking about what happens with those 6 pillars. Some congregations are helping the youth select curriculum for Sunday morning, and then the youth group meets at a different time, so that there's a process of that is not just all youth decided and youth led, because that is then limits what the youth get from what the youth have experience and ability to do, or even have the idea to come up with. So I'm seeing hybrids.
Yeah, I would largely agree that it's in my situation at least, it's both where us as youth leaders, we get to say, here's some of the things we want to do, and then some of the adults are just like, here are the things that we think are good for you to do that you really should do. And so I see both things happening, where we have input, but then there's also adults telling us this is important for you.
Yeah, like I mentioned earlier, we would write down these topics, but there was also adult involvement in that. And we also, at least like once or twice a month, would try to cover something from, I don't know what curriculum exactly the adults had already set out, but it did cover like our 7 principles and all of that, like grounding sort of basic UU principles.
There's a resource that's at the end of this webinar. It's a previous webinar called Youth Ministry, A Balanced Approach, that talks about some approaches that balance youth and adult voice and selection of curriculum. In fact, there's a curricular format called soul surfing that we came up with at First Unitarian Denver that really engages both. And I would highlight the importance of integrating attending adult worship as a part of the curriculum, so that youth go through their experience having a sense of what adult worship feels like. And then not just leaving, but going out to coffee and having conversation and talking about what came up as a result of that experience. That webinar highlights much more in depth than I just went, but check it out.
Do we have time for this one more question in the chat box? It looks like a good one we should answer. Also side yes. Delicate balance with youth who are passionate yet have boundary issues, such as like not knowing how to get through to them. They don't come to trainings, or they come late or leave early. What to do? I think that we need to be able to hold youth accountable, and that's gentle. It's not public, at least at first, and involves sitting down and saying, here's the problem. It involves getting other youth involved in that conversation, but I do see frequently youth not being held accountable in ways they should. And the problem with that is that frequently the problems build until it's a really big issue.
Yeah, and sometimes with these types of youth, it'll piss off other youth.
I can even speak for myself that when I was a part of our youth adult committee, there were times when I didn't show up to meetings or didn't want to, or I had other things going on, and it can be kind of easy to just kind of like, we do this every month. But I would have other youth who would reach out to me and say, hey, where are you? We're waiting for you. We need you at this meeting. So empowering the youth around that person. So it's not, maybe you can't get through to them, but their friends can.
Great example of that coaching thing too, and the accountability. Oh, the youth advisors were the ones that need to be held accountable. Then we're talking about a supervision structure. So I think it's important that our youth advisors know who they work for. They work for the mission and vision of the congregation and how they fit into the structure, and we do need to be able to hold them accountable. But this is a form of ministry that is a high commitment, and if you're not ready to do it or you can't do it right now, being willing to step in. Sometimes we're afraid that then we won't have any adults. And actually, I think if we take seriously what we need, we raise the quality of the adults that will step in. There are adults who aren't going to step in if this position is not being taken seriously. And probably this particular youth advisors are similar to the stories of the youth not following through. I bet the other youth advisors aren't too happy with them either.
And if there are other questions in the follow-up email, we can put Eric and Evan's email addresses so you can continue this conversation as well.
Thank you, Jenica. So here just these will be in the email as well, resources we've mentioned. The Central East Youth Adult Code of Conduct is a new document. I think the most recent draft of a code of conduct for adults working with youth. We've mentioned some books. The Contemplative Youth Ministry book, I'll highlight here because we haven't. It is talking about who we are with youth as being maybe more important than the like whether or not we have the fancy program. And yes, you do have to do some Jesus translation.
And I made a reference to the webinar. It gets into some of the history too of Why Are You You, LRY, and some of the other youth structures. So if you're interested, or some of the language today was like, whoa, what was that? I didn't quite understand that. This webinar, A Youth Ministry, A Balanced Approach, might help you learn a little bit more.
So our closing quote today is from Robin Dance. Some of us will make tiny ripples and others will send waves crashing, but each one will change the surface of the water forever.
We invite you to sign up for next month's webinar, which will be Safety in Youth Ministry with me and Kimberly Sweeney. And thank you all for joining us.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Great job, Kabir and Hope.
Oh, I shall stop recording now.